Welcome, dear listener. I'm grateful you're here tonight. Tell me, where are you listening from? How's the weather around you? Cold? Warm? A little in between? Share it below so our cozy circle grows. Settle in now. Let the candle light steady. Let your tea breathe. And let the quiet of evening wrap around you. Because tonight, the village will remember what silence tries to hide. A winter evening had settled gently over street. Merry Mead, the kind of evening that wrapped the village in a hush so soft it felt almost like a blanket. Snow rested lightly on cottage roofs. Lamps glowed with a warm, amber steadiness. The lanes were quiet, touched only by the faint crunch of a distant step or the rustle of a hedgerow stirring under the cold. It was the sort of night when people stayed close to their fires, grateful for warmth, grateful for peace, grateful for the small comforts that make village life feel like home. Inside her sitting room, Miss Marple sat near the hearth, knitting held loosely in her hands. The fire whispered, each ember shifting with a calm purpose. Her needles clicked in a gentle rhythm, steady and familiar, like a heartbeat she had known all her life. She liked evenings like this, evenings that asked nothing of her, evenings that allowed her to think quietly, stitch by stitch, thought by thought. There was something almost soothing in the way the flames swayed, never hurried, never cross, simply present. Miss Marple believed that a peaceful night taught a person more about themselves than any grand event. It showed what one noticed, and what one overlooked. Outside her window, the village rested in its December calm. The bakery had closed early. Its warm scent lingered faintly in the air. The post office lamp flickered as though tired from a busy day. Down the lane, the church bell had given its last gentle chime, before falling silent for the night. And yet, in all this stillness, there was movement too small, subtle, human. Miss Marple paused in her knitting as she caught sight of a figure near the gate of the house opposite hers. Mr. Leonard Hargreaves, usually a cheerful man with a ready word for anyone who passed, stood stiffly by his garden wall. His coat collar pulled high, his shoulders drawn up, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone, or hoping no one saw him at all. It wasn't like him. Not on a night like this. Not at such an hour. He seemed to be waiting for something that refused to arrive. Or perhaps he was dreading something that already had. Miss Marple lowered her knitting ever so slightly. People revealed themselves in quiet moments, especially when they believed no one was watching. And on this gentle winter night, warm fire, soft snow, stillness all around, she sensed it. Something faint, something quiet, something wrong. The village square glowed softly under a trail of lanterns, each one carried by a child bundled in wool, scarves, and mufflers that bobbed with every careful step. It was the evening of the Christmas lantern walk, a simple event, a gentle one, a tradition that Street Mary Mead held close. Families gathered near the tea stall set up by Mrs. Weatherby, who insisted every cup should be hot enough to warm the truth out of anyone. Her laugh floated through the air, warm and familiar, and people smiled as they accepted their cups. The lanterns swayed in small golden arcs. The snow glistened. Neighbors called to each other with soft greetings, voices wrapped in winter warmth. Miss Marple moved through the square with her usual quiet grace, her knitted scarf tucked close to her chin. Children waved at her as they passed, delighted to show her their hand-painted lanterns, stars, trees, tiny robins, all made with earnest pride. She praised each one gently. She liked moments like these. Simple joys, small efforts. People gathered for no reason except to be together. Yet even in warm crowds, she knew how human nature liked to hide things, and how the cold made clues show more easily. She noticed the first subtle ripple near the tea table. Mrs. Felton, usually quick with conversation, held her cup with both hands, gripping the porcelain too tightly. Her smile flickered. Her eyes darted toward her husband, who stood nearby pretending to be absorbed in adjusting the lantern string. A tension, a hesitation, a shared look that shifted away when Miss Marple approached. She didn't pry. She didn't need to. people whispered more with their silence. Further along, young Emily Pratt stood by the church railings, her lantern glowing softly against her coat. But she wasn't watching the children or the decorations. She was watching the crowd instead, watching faces, watching reactions, watching for something or someone. Every time someone passed too near, she stepped back, clutching her lantern closer, shoulders tightening, a nervous habit, one she tried to hide by, smiling too quickly. Miss Marple continued strolling, greeting neighbors, nodding toward old Mr. Dunning, who was attempting to negotiate with 3 children over the last ginger biscuit. She let herself enjoy the warmth of it, the laughter, the small charms of village life. But while she enjoyed them, she also observed them. That was her way. That was how she kept the peace, by understanding the small shifts before they turned into storms. Then she saw him, a man she did not recognize, standing at the far edge of the green, alone, hands in his coat, shoulders stiff. He wasn't watching the lanterns. He wasn't watching the children. He was watching the people, watching them with a measured calm, as though he knew something about them that they did not know about him. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply stood, set apart from the warmth, like a shadow trimming the edge of the night. Miss Marple paused. Her breath caught softly in the cold air. The lanterns glowed. The tea steamed. The laughter drifted. But beneath it, just beneath, she felt it. A shift, a tremor, a change in the mood of the night. The lantern walk drifted naturally toward the church path, where the snow lay in soft, untouched sheets, and the lamps cast long, gentle lines across the ground. The air carried a hush now. Not silence, just a calm that settled over people when a festive moment paused to breathe. Miss Marple walked slowly behind the group, letting the children scatter ahead while the adults mingled, their voices blending into a soft hum. It was a pleasant sound, the sort that wrapped itself around winter evenings like a friendly scarf. But pleasant sounds had a way of thinning at the edges, revealing sharper notes underneath. As Miss Marple stepped closer to the hedgerow bordering the path, she caught the tail end of a conversation. Low voices, urgent, tight. A man and a woman. Their words too hushed to be clear, but the tone unmistakable. She paused, only briefly, letting her hands rest over the top of her walking cane. She wasn't eavesdropping. She never eavesdropped. She simply allowed the world to speak when it already wanted to. The woman's voice trembled just slightly, but enough for Miss Marple to hear the strain. A strain of fear or frustration, or something deeper. Then the man responded. His tone clipped, cold at the edges, like someone trying to control a truth that refused to stay contained. The argument ended abruptly when they realized footsteps drew near. Miss Marple stepped forward with a gentle greeting, but the pair parted immediately, the woman moving toward the lanterns, her eyes downcast, her hands shaking, the man turning away altogether, avoiding her gaze entirely. His jaw was tight, his coat pulled close, his step too quick for someone simply enjoying the evening. The cold did not make people tremble, not like that. Miss Marple continued walking, allowing the lantern glow to warm her thoughts. She believed in giving people space. Secrets often walked beside people long before they ever reached a detective's attention. But tonight, those secrets seemed a little too restless. Near the churchyard gate, she noticed another disruption. A young boy darted past, nearly colliding with her skirt. She steadied him with a soft hand on his shoulder. He apologized in a shaky whisper, his eyes wider than the moment required. Miss Marple smiled, reassured him, then stepped aside as he hurried off. Only then did she notice what had fallen at her feet, a small silver button, polished, distinctive, out of place on a child's coat. Before she could pick it up, a gloved hand reached quickly from the side, snatching it with a rigid efficiency. The owner of the hand, a woman bundled in a dark coat, murmured an excuse and tucked the button swiftly into her pocket. Too swiftly. It wasn't the button itself that concerned Miss Marple. It was the speed with which someone wanted it hidden, and the quiet tension settling between people who had entered the night in festive cheer. She walked on, her steps soft, her thoughts steady, her knitting bag brushing lightly against her hip. Patterns always formed early. If one simply watched long enough, they revealed themselves. The lantern walk had drifted into its most peaceful moment. Children gathered near the church steps, their lanterns glowing like tiny constellations, each flame trembling softly in the winter breeze. Adults exchanged warm chatter, cups of tea steaming gently in the cold air. It was a scene of comfort, of simple joy, of quiet December magic until the night broke open. A scream shattered the calm. Sharp, sudden, raw enough to freeze every lantern mid-sway. Conversation stopped. Teacups stilled. Coats rustled as everyone turned toward the source, the side of the church, where the shadows pooled thicker, darker, deeper than the rest of the square. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then children pressed against their parents. Mothers stepped forward. Men hurried toward the steps. The hush of the winter night collapsed beneath panic. Miss Marple reached the church path with careful steps, her scarf fluttering lightly at her collar. She did not rush. Rushing never helped anyone think. The crowd had already begun to gather in a tight circle, bodies packed close, breath clouding in fast white bursts. Someone called for the constable, voice trembling. Someone else whispered a prayer, and at the very center, at the edge of the lantern glow, lay a man sprawled across the cold stone. He wasn't moving. His coat was twisted, one glove missing, his hat a short distance away. Lantern light fell across his face, pale and still, and the villagers cried out as recognition spread. But Miss Marple didn't step closer. She didn't lean in or hover over the fallen figure. Her eyes traveled instead to the living. The faces surrounding the dead, the hands clutching coats, the shoulders drawn, tight. Fear told stories long before mouths did. Mrs. Felton stood rigid, both hands pressed to her face, yet her eyes weren't on the body. They flicked toward her husband, toward the stranger near the edge, toward anything except the man at their feet. Mr. Felton's jaw worked silently, as though trying to swallow words he didn't dare say. Young Emily Pratt shook, with a fear that seemed too large for the moment. Her lantern slipped from her fingers, hitting the ground with a soft thud. She bent quickly, almost desperately, to pick it up again, but her hands trembled too much to steady the candle. Miss Marple watched each movement, every blink, every breath. The body was tragic, yes, but the living were louder. The stranger, the aloof man from earlier, stood a few steps back, arms folded tightly across his chest. His gaze wasn't panicked like the others. It was calculating, observing, measuring the room the way a man might measure danger before it touched him. And then Miss Marple saw it. A reaction that didn't match the night. Didn't match the shock. Didn't match anything but guilt trying to hide behind fright. One villager stepped forward too quickly, too dramatically, too ready to collapse in the center of the scene, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her breath steady. Someone here was playing a part. The village square had become a storm of emotions wrapped inside winter breath. Fear flickered through every whisper. Guilt trembled in half-finished sentences. Anger sparked between neighbors who, only minutes before, had shared tea and lantern light. When tragedy visits a village, it never arrives quietly. It shakes loose every hidden grievance, every buried worry, every unspoken truth people thought they had tucked safely into their pockets. Miss Marple stood near the outer edge of the crowd, letting the constable take control of the scene while she watched the far more revealing chaos unfolding between the villagers themselves. People spoke too quickly or too slowly, or avoided speaking at all. Small details surfaced like ripples, each carrying its own weight. Some wounds were fresh, some old, some too new to understand. She approached Mrs. Felton first, gently, almost as though she were interrupting a fragile thought rather than a fearful moment. Mrs. Felton held her shawl tight around her shoulders, eyes darting over every face as though searching for a safe one. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "you were near the church before the scream, were you not?" Mrs. Felton swallowed, nodded, then hesitated. I went to look for Leonard," she whispered, but her gaze shifted not toward the direction her husband had gone, but toward the stranger standing near the lantern pole. A small tremor ran through her hand, too small to notice unless one had spent a lifetime observing the slight movements of human nature. Miss Marple didn't press her. She simply thanked her, offered a warm, calming squeeze of her hand, and moved on. Near the steps, Mr. Hargreaves paced with frantic energy, muttering something under his breath. When Miss Marple approached him, he nearly jumped. "Mr. Hargreaves," she said gently, "you seem troubled." He blinked rapidly, as though clearing fog from his thoughts. "It's this dreadful business," he said. "Terrible, terrible. I didn't see anything. Nothing at all. I was fetching my lantern." "Yes, that's it. Fetching my lantern." But Miss Marple had seen his lantern earlier, still unlit, hanging exactly where it always did near his garden gate. A small lie. A nervous lie. A lie told too quickly. Before she could speak further, a young child tugged at her sleeve. Little Thomas Pratt looked up at her with wide eyes. "Miss Marple," he whispered, "I found something." He held out his mittened hand, and in it lay a torn piece of dark wool, a glove scrap, frayed at the edge. He said he found it near the stone path behind the Badger's church. Miss Marple examined it briefly, tucking it gently into her coat pocket. Another piece of the night. Another thread in a weaving tapestry. But it wasn't the glove. It wasn't the lies. It wasn't the hidden looks or the trembling voices. It was the timing. The tangled stories that did not fit together. And as she stood beneath the lantern glow, Miss Marple saw the first real contradiction take shape. In the minutes after the body was carried into the vestry, the village seemed to move with a strange, uneven rhythm, as though every person stepped to a different beat of fear. Lanterns still glowed across the square, but their warmth felt thinner now, their light stretching across uneasy faces. People clustered in small groups, whispering quickly, whispering nervously, whispering as though each word tugged at a different piece of the night's truth. Miss Marple walked slowly among them, her presence quiet, steady, soothing like a hand resting gently on troubled shoulders. She knew nights like this. Nights where guilt and fear made people confess things they had kept hidden for years, even if those secrets had nothing to do with the matter at hand. Human nature often spilled out sideways. The first confession came from Mrs. Weatherby herself, cheeks flushed bright as she clutched her wool apron. "Miss Marple," she whispered urgently, "I must tell someone. I burned the first batch of ginger biscuits. Burned them terribly. Threw them out before anyone saw. Awful waste. Dreadful. I couldn't bear for the vicar to know." Miss Marple placed a kind hand on her arm. "Burnt biscuits," she said gently, "rarely lead to murder, Mrs. Weatherby." The woman sighed with such relief that one might have thought she'd been absolved of a grave crime instead of a simple kitchen mishap. "Further along the lantern path, Mr." Dunning waved Miss Marple over with dramatic concern. He adjusted his scarf twice before speaking, as if arranging truth itself. "I was at home until precisely 7:30, he announced, then walked straight here, didn't stop anywhere, didn't speak to anyone." Miss Marple nodded politely. But she remembered seeing him earlier near the post office, glancing toward the church at a time that was certainly before 7:30. His timeline wavered like a candle exposed to wind. She said nothing, merely thanked him, letting him continue believing his version of events was intact, for the moment. As she moved through the square, more villagers approached with small confessions. A forgotten debt, a quarrel from last week, a worried thought about a relative, misunderstandings layered upon misunderstandings. None pointed directly to the murder, yet each clouded the picture, as if the entire village had exhaled a fog around the truth. But even in fog, shapes remained. Miss Marple noticed how Emily Pratt clung to her lantern, her shoulders trembling not with cold, but something deeper. Emily's mother stood beside her, answering questions quickly, too quickly, as though the right timing of events might slip out of her grasp if she paused to breathe. Miss Marple asked a gentle question. Nothing sharp, nothing intrusive. Yet Emily's reaction was startling. Her grip tightened so suddenly that her knuckles went white. Her eyes darted not toward the church, but towards someone across the square. Miss Marple followed the direction of that frightened glance, and there, unexpected, unsettling, utterly out of place, she saw a tension rising around a person she had not suspected at all. The longer the villagers remained gathered in the lantern-lit square, the more the night seemed to loosen tongues that had long stayed sealed. Fear does that. It shakes the edges of secrets. It warms confessions that might have stayed icy for years. Miss Marple moved gently through the clusters of uneasy neighbours, listening not for the loudest claims, but for the softest tremors, the ones that slipped through when people forgot to guard their words. Near the church wall, Mr. Porter stood fussing with the brim of his hat, adjusting it again and again, though it sat perfectly straight. He glanced around nervously before leaning toward Miss Marple with a low, urgent whisper. "You know how it is," he murmured. "One gets into a bit of financial difficulty now and then. Just a small sum. Just a little debt. Nothing serious." He cleared his throat. "But some people, they don't let such things rest." Miss Marple nodded kindly, offering the sort of understanding look that invited truth without demanding it. "Someone was pressing you?" she asked softly. He winced. "I'd rather not say who, but yes, a firm reminder, maybe more than firm." His eyes darted to the church steps, then away, as though the memory itself weighed too heavily. A small shadow of guilt passed across his face. Debt, pressure, fear, they often travelled in pairs, and sometimes in threes. Further along the path, Miss Marple overheard two women muttering behind a row of lanterns that had been set down on the snow. Their voices were low, but tension thinned their whispers. "He found out, I tell you," one said. "He knew about the letters." The other shook her head quickly. "You mustn't say such things aloud. Not tonight. Not with everyone already on edge. Letters. Plural." Miss Marple let the words settle in her thoughts like a key placed gently on a table. Near the tea stall, she paused again, as she noticed Mr. Hargreaves speaking tightly to his wife. The conversation was short, sharp. A few clipped sentences, a hissed warning, a whispered retort. As Miss Marple approached, they separated instantly too, instantly offering polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Secrets had begun to leak through the night, and Miss Marple, with her lifelong practice of quiet observation, gathered them as naturally as knitting gathers stitches. Every tremor, every sidelong glance, every fragment of speech. But the final piece of the puzzle, at least for the moment, came when she spoke with young Emily Pratt again. Emily's mother hovered protectively, answering quickly, but the girl let slip a small, frightened whisper. "He said he would tell, if I didn't." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Tell what, dear?" she asked. But the girl bit her lip and shook her head, eyes filling with dread. Blackmail, hidden letters, debt, fear, all circling the victim like cold wind around a lamp. And then, in the quiet of her own thoughts, Miss Marple reached a single, chilling realization. Someone in this village had far more than fear to hide. Someone had a reason deep, personal, urgent to silence the victim forever. The night should have begun settling after the body was taken inside the vestry. Villagers should have started drifting home, lanterns dimming, conversations softening into weary goodbyes. But fear has a way of tightening its grip just when people think the worst has already happened. And in Street Mary Mead, fear rarely travelled alone. The constable instructed everyone to stay close while he took statements. Families huddled together beneath the lanterns. Neighbours whispered theories, half-truths, and hurried reassurances. Miss Marple stood near the church railings, her expression thoughtful, calm, watching the way. Unease flowed from one person to another, like cold wind weaving through a crowd. She had seen fear before, many times, but even she sensed something shifting beneath the surface of this night. Then a cry burst from the direction of the green, sharp, breathless, frightened enough to cut through every other sound. Heads turned. Lanterns swung. People ran toward the voice. The snow crunched under dozens of hurried steps, and Miss Marple followed, her pace steady but intent. It was Mrs. Weatherby at the center of the commotion, her apron fluttering wildly as she pointed a trembling hand toward the tea stall. "It's been broken into," she gasped. The drawer I keep the money tin in, it's been pulled open. Everything tossed about. And someone tried to burn something inside. Villagers crowded the small wooden stall. The drawer hung open, contents scattered across the counter. A half-burned slip of paper, still smouldered in a cracked saucer, a corner of handwriting visible before flame had eaten the rest. Miss Marple leaned close. The ink blotches, the rushed strokes. Someone had been desperate to destroy it. But why here? And why now? Mrs. Felton clutched her shawl with both hands. "This is madness," she whispered. "Utter madness. Who would do such a thing while we're all standing here?" Her voice cracked at the edges, fear scraping against something deeper. Before anyone could answer, another alarm rang across the square. Young Thomas Pratt ran toward the group, cheeks flushed, lantern swinging wildly in his hand. "Emily," he shouted. "Emily's gone. She was standing by the railings, and now she's not. She's not anywhere." A fresh wave of panic surged. Emily's mother cried out, rushing forward, calling her daughter's name again and again, voice breaking with each repetition. Neighbors scattered through the square, searching behind stalls, around hedges, near the churchyard gate. Lanterns bobbed anxiously through the night like fireflies trapped in a storm. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, letting the noise fade into a distant hum. She pictured the broken drawer, the burned note, the missing girl, and the earlier whisper he said he would tell. If I didn't. Fear wasn't drifting through the village anymore. It was tightening, hardening, closing in. When she opened her eyes, she looked not toward the victim, but toward the crowd, because somewhere among them, someone had escalated, deliberately, desperately, and Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty the killer was no longer hiding. The killer was moving. The village had scattered into uneasy pockets of searchers, each lantern's glow drifting through the winter darkness like small, worried stars. Emily's name echoed in soft, trembling calls along the square. Mothers huddled together, fathers checked behind hedges and stalls. Children watched with wide, frightened eyes. Yet in all this movement, Miss Marple did what she always did. In times of uncertainty, she stepped quietly away and began retracing the steps the night had already taken. Calm, deliberate, unhurried. She moved first to the church path, where the lanterns still cast their honey-colored light across the untouched snow. The footprints remained where they had been hours earlier, fresh, overlapping, confused. But confusion often hid order. She studied the patterns, studied the depth, studied the direction. The heavy footprints near the door belonged to the constable and the men who had lifted the body. The lighter ones, the scattered ones, belonged to frightened villagers. But a separate trail, subtle, but present, led away from the church, not toward the green, a direction rarely chosen, a direction chosen only by someone avoiding eyes. She turned slowly, letting her thoughts settle like stray threads weaving into a single quiet tapestry. Then she walked toward the tea stall. The drawer remained open, its contents exactly as the constable had left them. The half-burned paper curved slightly as the cold air tightened its edges. Miss Marple didn't touch it, but she leaned near enough to see the faint ink that survived the flame swirls that looked like part of a signature. Only part. Only a piece. People who burned evidence rarely did so calmly, and rarely did so with time to spare. Next, she returned to the place where Emily had last stood, the lantern railings along the churchyard. She looked not at the ground, but at the air, at the space Emily had filled only minutes before, a trembling lantern, a frightened gaze, a whisper about someone threatening to tell. Miss Marple stood there for a long while, breathing in the cold, letting the stillness speak. Slowly, she turned. Faces came back to her. Voices, timelines, excuses, half-truths, too many to name, yet only a few that mattered. Mrs. Weatherby's confession of burnt biscuits held no weight. Mr. Dunning's shifting story did. Mrs. Felton's trembling eyes did. Emily's fear did. The stranger's calm did. Piece by piece, she filtered the night, removed the noise, lifted the mist, softened the edges, and then she gently placed each clue in the order it belonged. The argument behind the hedgerow, the stolen moment near the church, the glove scrap, the burned paper, the missing girl, the carefully timed reactions. It was never the number of clues that mattered in a village mystery. It was how they chose to lean toward each other. And now, as Miss Marple stood beneath the lantern, glow, she saw it clearly the moment when the killer acted. The single sliver of time when no one was watching. The window that allowed a crime to slip through the night, unnoticed. A window that had now opened itself fully in her mind. Miss Marple had always believed that truth, when gently approached, tended to open its door without force. And tonight, with the village trembling beneath lantern light and fear growing like frost along the edges of every whispered sentence, she knew exactly whose door she needed to knock on quietly, softly, and with the kind of calm that unsettled only the guilty. She found Mr. Hargreaves standing alone near the church porch, pretending to straighten a lantern hook that required no straightening. His fingers moved too quickly. His breath showed in short, uneven clouds. The man who earlier had hovered with anxious energy now seemed determined to keep himself occupied with trivial tasks, as though distraction could tidy away truth. Miss Marple approached with a gentle step, her scarf tucked neatly beneath her coat. "Mr. Hargreaves," she said softly, "these are difficult moments for all of us. I imagine they weigh heavily on you." He froze, hand suspended midair. "On me," he said too quickly. "Why would they? Terrible business, yes, but I had nothing to do with it." The denial trembled at the edges, its firmness cracking like thin ice over cold water. Miss Marple nodded, her expression warm, almost grandmotherly. "Of course. And yet, you changed your timeline earlier. First you said you were home until 7:30, but I recall seeing you near the post office before that. You seemed unsettled." A silence fell between them, a long one, the sort of silence that squeezed truth closer and closer until it had no room left to hide. He cleared his throat, adjusting his coat collar. I remembered incorrectly," he muttered. "The night was busy. People everywhere. Easy to mix things up." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, studying his face the way one examines handwriting, small strokes, slight curves, hesitations that reveal far more than bold declarations ever could. "Understandable," she said gently. "But you weren't simply walking. You were watching the church. And the man who died tonight, he spoke with you earlier, didn't he?" A flicker crossed his eyes, swift, sharp, unguarded, then gone. "Spoke? No, I barely knew him." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "He threatened someone tonight," she said softly. "Someone close to you. Someone young. Someone frightened. Emily Pratt's look told me enough. Children don't know how to mask fear. Adults do." Mr. Hargreaves stiffened, the lantern's glow harshening the tension in his shoulders. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then the half-truth slipped out, scraped by guilt and desperation. He wasn't a kind man," he whispered. "He had information. About my family. About things that should never have left the past. I only wanted to speak with him, to reason with him, to keep Emily safe. That's all." Miss Marple listened quietly, letting his words fall gently into place like puzzle pieces finding their edges. A half-truth, yes, but half-truths always pointed toward what remained hidden. She thanked him with soft courtesy, touched his arm with a reassuring steadiness, and began walking back toward the lantern path. And as she moved through the cold night, her breath warm against the winter air, she felt it settle inside her, the missing piece she had been waiting for, the piece that pulled the pattern together, the piece that finally revealed where the truth had been hiding all along. The village had begun to tire under the weight of the night. Lantern flames wavered softly, flickering as if mirroring the nerves of the people holding them. Children were taken indoors, tea cooled in forgotten cups. Conversations lowered into murmurs that drifted like thin strands of smoke through the cold air. But Miss Marple remained steady, her thoughtful steps guiding her back toward the heart of the square where truth was finally beginning to stir. Just as she approached the church railings, she heard a hesitant voice call her name. "Miss Marple, I think, I remember something." It was old Mr. Abernathy, a man known for his gentle forgetfulness and fondness for small details that others considered unimportant. He wrung his cap between his hands, looking torn between wanting to help and fearing he might be mistaken. Miss Marple gave him a warm, encouraging smile, one that invited truth to come forward without judgment. "It may be nothing," he began. "Truly nothing at all. But I saw the victim earlier today, near the vicarage gate. He was reading a letter. Looked mighty upset, he did. Stared at it for a long time. Then he crumpled it up and tucked it inside his bride coat." Miss Marple's eyes softened with quiet interest. "A letter, you say? Did you see who gave it to him?" Mr. Abernathy shook his head. "No, ma'am. But I saw the paper blow loose when he dropped it. Just the corner. Looked like official writing. Ledger lines, maybe. Numbers. And a name, I think. A paper. A number. A name." Miss Marple thanked him with genuine kindness and made her way toward the church vestry, where the constable had stored the victim's belongings. The air inside was cold, the scent of stone and dust lingering like an old memory. She approached the small table where a folded coat lay neatly beside a torn glove and a few scattered coins. Gently, she searched the pockets. A receipt, a ticket stub, a worn handkerchief. And then, tucked between the inner lining and the seam, easy to overlook, easy to hide, she found it. A scrap of paper, crumpled, smeared at the edges, but legible enough to reveal its weight. A ledger page, marked with overdue sums, and a single name circled twice in ink. It was not the name of Mr. Hargreaves, nor the Feltons, nor the stranger who had stood apart. It was someone no one had considered, someone who had stayed quiet, someone who had slipped through every part of the night without drawing suspicion at all. Miss Marple held the paper between her fingers, feeling the cold truth nestled inside the numbers. The timeline shifted, the motive twisted, every assumption tilted on its axis. She stepped back into the lantern light, her breath steady, her eyes clear. For the first time all evening, she realized something profoundly simple. The killer wasn't the person everyone feared. The killer was the person no one feared at all. The village, once wrapped in the softness of winter calm, now pulsed with unease beneath the lantern light. Rumors spread as quickly as the cold. A whisper here, a sharp word there. People clung to fragments of truth, shaping them into stories that twisted through the evening like drifting snow. Lanterns glowed in trembling hands. Tea cooled untouched. Families huddled closer, all trying to make sense of a night that had turned their familiar world upside down. Accusations grew louder as fear took deeper root. Mr. Dunning, usually mild-mannered, pointed toward the Feltons with a shaky indignation, claiming he had always suspected something odd. "Mrs." Pratt insisted the stranger must be involved, though she could not explain how. Even quiet Mrs. Weatherby, flustered beyond her usual cheerful composure, muttered about dark dealings and old sins knocking on new doors. And once old grievances were called upon, they came quickly. Years-long disputes resurfaced. Forgotten slights reawakened. The village seemed to split into corners of discomfort, each corner casting sidewise glances at the others. Miss Marple moved gently among them, listening, nodding, offering a comforting word here and there. But her true attention was not on the rumors themselves. It was on the psychological shifts beneath them. Fear makes people forget what they know. Panic makes them remember only what they want. And guilt, even unrelated guilt, often has a way of speaking louder than innocence. She watched as Mr. Hargreaves avoided Mr. Porter's gaze, watched Mrs. Felton cling to her husband's arm, while her eyes drifted, again and again, toward the stranger at the edge of the green. Watched Emily's mother pace with frantic steps, calling her daughter's name, even though Miss Marple suspected Emily was far nearer and far safer than anyone imagined. People forget themselves when truth draws near. Their instincts speak first, their fears second, their words last of all. Miss Marple allowed each reaction to settle in her mind like flakes of snow landing quietly on a windowsill. Slowly, softly, each adding a layer of meaning. Because villages have a way of telling the truth without realizing it. And tonight, Street Mary Mead was speaking loudly. From somewhere near the tea stall came a sharp argument about the timeline of events. Someone insisted the scream came earlier. Someone else insisted it came later. The constable tried to restore order, but people talked over one another, the night growing tighter with misunderstanding. Miss Marple stayed at the edges, watching the confusion unfold, not correcting, not guiding, not yet. Because truth, she knew, reveals itself best when others scramble to hide it. And then, as the murmurs swirled and the lanterns trembled, she felt it a tug in her memory. Something small, something quiet, something from much earlier in the night. A detail overlooked, a detail spoken only once, a detail that did not belong among fear or rumor. Her breath stilled slightly. A soft spark lit behind her eyes. Because suddenly, finally, a detail from the beginning of the story stepped forward, and everything began to change. The lanterns burned lower now, their soft glow, dimming as the night deepened around the village. Street Mary Mead felt suspended, caught in a hush between fear and revelation. Neighbors murmured in uneasy groups, their voices weaving a quilt of worry across the frosted air. Children were ushered home. Doors cracked open as residents peeked outside, waiting for news that refused to come. Through it all, Miss Marple moved with quiet purpose, her thoughts gathering like threads pulled gently through cloth. She walked back toward the hedgerow, where she had first heard the tense conversation earlier in the evening. Winter branches shimmered faintly with frost, each twig holding the night's tension as though afraid to let it fall. Miss Marple bent slowly, examining the crushed snow beneath the bushes. There, half hidden under a drift, something glinted weakly under the lantern light. She brushed the snow aside and lifted it. A small brass key. Cold, heavy, distinctive, not belonging to anything near the church. Her eyes softened, with recognition. She had seen that shape before. She slipped it into her coat pocket and continued along the path, her mind tracing the night step by step. The argument behind the hedge, the burned paper, the disappearing girl, the shifting stories, the ledger scrap naming someone no one noticed. And, now, this key, an item with no reason to be here unless someone had led the victim to a place they should not have gone. Miss Marple paused in the stillness, letting the cold air settle around her. She closed her eyes briefly, calling forward the voices of the night. Emily's trembling whisper, Mrs. Felton's frightened glances, Mr. Hargreaves' half-truth, Mr. Porter's debt, the stranger's watchfulness, all separate threads, all drifting aimlessly, until now, because one memory rose above the rest, an early one, quiet enough to be dismissed. A small moment, a simple gesture, a nervous habit from someone who should not have been nervous at all. Miss Marple breathed slowly, allowing the pieces to fit together. Motive, opportunity, behavior. The victim had been blackmailing someone desperate, someone terrified of exposure, someone who had the key to the one place the victim should never have found, someone who tried to destroy evidence but acted too quickly, someone who vanished from attention not by skill but by innocence assumed. The emotional core settled heavily within her. The crime had not come from malice alone, but from fear so consuming it had driven an ordinary village heart to a terrible act. She opened her eyes, calm as snowfall. The puzzle was no longer scattered. It was whole, complete, clear enough to hold without trembling. Miss Marple turned toward the constable, who stood near the church doors, speaking with a group of shaken villagers. She approached quietly, her footsteps soft against the frozen path. "Constable," she said in her gentle, steady voice, "would you be so kind as to gather everyone?" Because the moment had come. The truth, at last, was ready to be spoken. They gathered as dusk settled lanterns, scarves, careful faces. The hall was warm. The air was tight. Boots scuffed the floor. Chairs creaked. No one spoke for long. A cough, a hush, another hush. Miss Marple stood near the small dais, hands folded, eyes gentle. She thanked them for coming. She said it softly, kindly. Calm spreads when someone chooses calm. The constable nodded from the doorway. A kettle ticked faintly in the anteroom. The village listened, because listening is easier than fear. Miss Marple began. She began with what seemed obvious: the scream by the church, the body on the stones, the flurry of shocks. Then she set the obvious aside. She traced movements, not rumors. Footsteps, not feelings. Who was near the square at 9? Who left early? Who returned late? She named times. She named paths. She named small truths. A lantern exchanged. A glove never claimed. A key half buried in snow. Each detail lifted like a stitched thread. Gently, patiently. The shape appeared under the fabric. She turned to the first cluster of suspicion. The neighbor who trembled. The baker who looked away. The young woman with the lantern. She softened her voice. People tremble for many reasons. Guilt is only one. She showed the room how grief looks like panic, how shame looks like silence, how a private sorrow can mimic a crime. She released one name, then another. Each, not the killer. The reasons landed with relief and ache. We judge fast. We love slow. We must do better. She said that kindly. Eyes softened. Tears glinted. The constable's pencil paused. One thread cut away. Next, she lifted the tangle around money. Old debts. New whispers. Blackmail hinted behind closed doors. She laid out the letters, the timings, the unsent note that threatened, but did not prove. She showed how the second shock, the break-in, the frantic search belonged to fear, not purpose. A frightened person tries to erase a past. A murderer hides the present. Different hands, different heartbeats. She removed the frightened hands from the center. The room breathed again. A little. Only a little. Then Miss Marple returned to the smallest things. The candle soot on a cuff. The wax fleck on a sleeve. The path in snow where none should be. The cup placed on the wrong tray. She spoke of patterns. Polite habits. Quiet pride. How the truly careful forget only the detail they never believed they could forget. The room leaned closer. She traced the time window between 2 carols and 1 bell stroke. She traced the choice of place public enough to shock, private enough to act. She traced the posture, the sudden anger, the practiced calm after, and she began to lift away the final veils. "Tonight," she said gently, "we set down our guesses and keep only the truths." Her eyes moved from face to face. Kind, unyielding. The footprints tell a path. The key tells a lock. The wax tells a hand. Chairs stilled, breaths held. In that quiet, a winter draught touched the lantern wicks. The flames steadied. Miss Marple's voice softened to a near whisper. Only one sequence fits. Only one heart gains. Only one motive survives. The hall was warm, yet no one felt it. Breath misted at the edges of fear. Coats rustled. A clock ticked. Miss Marple stood very still. Hands folded. Eyes kind. Her voice low. "We will be gentle," she said, "but we will be clear." She began with time. The lantern walk. The hymn. The scream. Each minute placed carefully on the table. No flourish. No drama. Just steps. Just truth. Faces tightened. A cough. A chair leg scraped. She spoke of the footprint by the church hedge. Light. Hesitant. Not a stranger's stride. Someone who knew the path. Someone who returned to wipe away what could not be wiped guilt. Then the objects. The torn glove. The brass key. The smudged note. Each small thing, simple alone, louder together. "The glove," she said, softly, "did not fit the tale we were told." The room shifted. "The key," she added, "was not from the vicarage, but from a private box, kept for letters best not read in daylight." A murmur. She lifted a hand. Calm returned. Money was asked. Pride was wounded. A history pressed its thumb upon the present. Her gaze moved to faces she had already freed. Mrs. Felton spoke in fear, not hatred. Emily trembled from truth, not deceit. The vicar withheld sorrow, not violence. Heads nodded. Relief, small and shaking, passed from one to another. She named the motive cleanly. Blackmail. Old debts. A reputation built on careful stone, threatened by one sharp whisper. The victim pushed, she said, and he was pushed back. She described the first quarrel behind the church door, the second meeting near the square, how the box was opened, how the letter was taken, how the knife or perhaps the blunt edge of panic did the thing that shatters nights. It was not craft, she said. It was fear. Fear does quick work. Eyes went to the prime suspect everyone had carried in their mouths all day. He stared at the floor. She shook her head. No. A long breath swept the benches. He lied to protect someone else and himself, but he did not kill. The room stilled again, tighter. Who then? Miss Marple's voice lowered. Gentle. Exact. It was the person who corrected the constable before he finished his question. The person who arrived too soon yet pretended to come late. The person who spoke of mercy, but prepared no alibi for the darkest 5 minutes of the night. She turned. Not quickly. Kindly. Davis Havisham. A small cry. A hand to a mouth. He tried to speak. The words staggered. He reached for dignity, found dust. I only meant to frighten him, he said. To take back the letters. To stop the ruin. His eyes were wet. His shoulders fell. The constable stepped forward, steady and pale. The village breathed as one, and not at all. Miss Marple inclined her head sad, not sharp. Fear asks a high price, she whispered. You have already paid the first coin. Silence pooled. Cups went cold. Somewhere, a hymn began in one frail mind and faded. Outside, the snow held its breath. And then another truth stirred in the shadows. The village exhaled slowly, as though the night had pressed upon it for hours longer than anyone could measure. Lantern flames softened, voices lowered. People drifted toward one another, not in fear now, but in the tentative, tremulous way neighbors do when they realize they have spoken too harshly, assumed too quickly, or let their panic rise where kindness should have stood. Mrs. Felton wiped her eyes and apologized to Mrs. Weatherby for snapping earlier. Mr. Dunning offered his scarf to young Thomas, remembering too late that the boy had lost his own in the confusion. Even the stranger, the aloof man who had watched everything from the edges, softened his posture, offering to help the constable gather the last statements before leaving quietly into the snow. Miss Marple moved through the hall with her gentle step, touching shoulders lightly, speaking calm into frightened hearts. She had never believed that judgment healed anything. Understanding did. And tonight she saw how deeply fear had threaded itself into ordinary people, good people who had let old worries and hidden shames twist their vision until every shadow became a threat. She reassured Mrs. Pratt that Emily's trembling did not reflect guilt, only fear of becoming tangled in something she could not name. She offered Mr. Porter a soft word about debts that many good souls had carried heavier burdens, and that nothing about his struggle made him less decent. She even paused to thank the stranger for his steady watchfulness, acknowledging that sometimes being quiet is not secrecy, it is simply solitude. Little by little, voices eased. People lingered not because they feared what waited outside, but because they needed the presence of one another. The hall warmed with humanity again, slowly, gently, like water simmering back to calm after a sudden boil. Someone brewed a fresh kettle of tea. Someone else offered biscuits that had survived the chaos. The constable, weary but grateful, leaned against the railing with a tired smile. Even the old clock on the wall ticked more softly now, as though it too had found compassion for the shaken village. Miss Marple stepped outside when the hall grew quieter. Snow floated down in small, delicate flakes, calm, unhurried, serene. She wrapped her scarf a little closer around her neck and let the cool air brush softly across her cheeks. Human motives, she knew, were rarely simple. Fear could push a person further than anger. Shame could silence louder than guilt. And regrets. Regrets often walked beside a person long before their neighbors ever realized. The village would need time to shed the night's weight, but it would find its way. Street Mary Mead always did. People learned. People grew. People softened again. She walked slowly along the familiar lane toward her cottage, passing lanterns that flickered gently against the falling snow. The square behind her quieted. The hall door closed. A hush settled across the village like a gentle blanket, and as Miss Marple reached her gate, hand resting lightly on the cold iron latch, she paused, thinking not of the murderer, but of the truth. Its weight, its patience, its quiet way of waiting to be seen. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, as another thought, soft, unfinished, rose in her mind, a thought that carried the faintest stir of something still unresolved. Davis returned to the quiet of the moment, his voice settling over the scene like a warm shawl at dusk. Evening light, or perhaps the first soft touch of morning, brushed the edge of the village roofs, turning the snow into a gentle shimmer. He spoke slowly, kindly, the way one speaks when the night has been long, and hearts need time to settle back into their calm. He reminded listeners that truth rarely arrives with thunder. It arrives quietly, patiently, the way a kettle cools before anyone notices. People may rush, fear may rise, but truth waits, always waits. And when it comes, it brings its own kind of mercy. He reflected on Miss Marple's steady steps, her soft questions, her way of seeing people not as suspects but as souls carrying burdens they seldom share. He reminded everyone that kindness loosens knots, that suspicion only tightens, and that patience, true patience, reveals what haste blinds. Then, in a gentle whisper, Davis offered the line that held the village together again. Truth cools slower than tea. He paused, letting it linger in the warm breath of the moment, and as he closed, his voice dipped just slightly, carrying one final tremor of mystery. But every quiet village holds one more secret. Davis's voice returned with a gentle warmth, like a lantern lifting in the quiet. He thanked everyone for walking through the night's mystery, for noticing the small things like the brass key in the snow and the torn glove no one claimed. Little clues, quiet clues, the kind that only careful hearts catch. He invited listeners to share their thoughts. "What moment stayed with you the most?" he asked softly. "And which clue did you spot before anyone else?" He paused, letting the room settle, letting the community breathe together for one last tender beat. Gratitude warmed his tone. Kind, steady, close. "Thank you for being here tonight," he murmured. "Your curiosity keeps these stories alive." Then came the ritual line, gentle as steam rising from a familiar cup. "Tomorrow, another kettle will boil." And with a whisper of promise, he added, "And another mystery waits just beyond the quiet." A soft whisper drifts in, the kind that settles at the edge of a quiet lane. Davis's voice lowers, almost secretive, as though sharing something found tucked beneath a teacup. He mentions a tiny object, a folded letter, slipped under a door where no footstep was heard, a room long forgotten, a drawer that should have been empty, but wasn't. He lets the silence breathe, lets curiosity warm, lets the night lean closer, and with one final whisper, he leaves it glowing. Something is coming, and it refuses to stay hidden.